Good morning, as always, welcome back to Pulsar. Happy Thursday to everyone. Let me tell you right away, we're joined today by Pier Giorgio Carrier. Welcome back.
Good morning, Daniela, and good morning to all the listeners.
Researcher, documentary filmmaker, we've already had the pleasure of hosting him in the past few months, and today we're going to talk about extraterrestrials, the sacred scriptures, and an ancient reality that's still present today. Well, as they say nowadays, that's quite a topic.
Yeah, Daniela, it's a subject that among researchers is rather old, maybe not as old as the Old Testament, but still, it's something that has been explored many times by lots of researchers all over the world. So, it is a very interesting topic because, of course, it's not meant to be blasphemous, but rather to reinterpret past events that, obviously, back then could only be seen in a certain way, and today, in the light of what humanity's scientific and cultural development has become, maybe we can understand a bit more. Just to give an example, maybe a silly one. If we took one of the apostles from 2,000 years ago and brought him to Rome or New York, he wouldn't understand this world with all its technology, which to him would seem absolutely magical, or maybe even the work of the devil. So, the ancient chronicles, including the scriptures, talk about events that people 2,000 years ago could only interpret and understand in ways that had nothing to do with science or technology. Things that, on the other hand, we can understand today. Since beyond what is technology itself, strictly speaking in terms of hardware, meaning solid objects, we also use invisible energies today: electricity, electromagnetism, photons and so on, things that 2,000 years ago were completely unknown. So, considering these facts that are quite clear and tangible throughout the historical development of humanity, we can also go back and review the ancient scriptures and see whether today they might be a bit more understandable than what sometimes seem like purely imaginary descriptions. So this process, which has been carried out by various authors, also raises, in my opinion, a new question, or rather, an additional one. But this reality that was so pervasive in ancient times, it's spoken of in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, meaning the Gospels, in the apocrypha, and even in the Acts of the Apostles, all these strange angelic presences. So, it's something that today we might wonder, could all that pervasive and immanent reality, as well as transcendent in ancient times, still be around us today, moving in our midst? Only that, because of the cultural gap that separates us from antiquity, we just can't recognize that the same reality, which today we may call by another name, is the same as 2,000 years ago. So, that's the starting point of the discussion, Daniela.
We need to understand and figure out which sacred scriptures we're actually referring to. And because depending on the religion you have determines the book you find, basically.
But look.
And there's also the issue of figuring out which ones we're referring to.
Of course, but we follow a religion that is Christianity, which is a religion derived from Judaism, because Christ, after all, came from Palestine, from ancient Palestine. So, I turn to and try to read the events from the scriptures that are familiar to us. Then I could also take on the ones from the Quran, or from other religions, say, the Hindu ones. But this discussion will already be challenging enough, let alone if we approach it from the perspective of other religions, that would be even harder, simply because, well, even just from the basic habit of going to church, some words have stuck with us over time. So, we'll mostly talk about the Bible, that is, about events connected to the biblical aspect, though in the list, let's say, of the topics I want to cover. Of course, I'll also take a look beyond religion itself, from a historical angle, and also at other religions, but on the side, because in fact this presence, this reality, is pervasive in all religions. Throughout the entire history of known religions, we find mysterious entities and unusual phenomena that, in the end, link them all under a similar kind of manifestation. I mean, this, anyway. Thanks for pointing it out, because it should be said, it's not a reality or an aspect that's only specific to Judaism or Christianity. It concerns all the religions of the planet.
It's cross-cutting, especially since even the Indian sacred scriptures, and I mean, whether one believes it or not, these things still appear even in Chinese writings.
Exactly, absolutely, across the whole planet. In fact, you see, for example, we can look at the covers of two books, which are these: The Bible and the Extraterrestrials, an old book by Raymond Drake, or The Bible and Flying Saucers by Barry Downing. So, I repeat, the question is, does this reality still exist? First, I'd like to do a sort of historical overview. So I'll show a series of slides and images that we need to start from some key points, laying the groundwork for a discussion that we can then expand to help people at home understand what we're talking about. So let's move on to the word angel, because obviously, if we're going to talk about presences in the scriptures, we have to refer to angels. The word angel comes from angelus in Latin, but it actually originates from the Greek word angelos, which doesn't mean, as some people who may not be very familiar with it or haven't looked into these topics might think, a man with wings. Quite simply, angelos means messenger. That is, someone who brings a message, a messenger, an envoy carrying a message. So angelic beings have always been depicted as men or women, because yes, there are female angels too, and they've always been shown in art, paintings, and also in sculptures, always with wings. So if we take the wings away from an angel, in fact, the angel has no real difference from the appearance of an ordinary human being, male or female. What's the difference then? It's that angels do things beyond human capability, things that we, ordinary mortals who are not angels in the biblical or gospel sense, are simply unable to do. Now, something that might be new to some people is that these angels or winged beings are not an exclusive feature of Christianity. They come from the very ancient history of humanity. Let's take a look at a few examples. Here, for instance, this is Angela, a female angelic being, a feminine angelic figure from Sumerian culture called Inanna. And as we can see in this very ancient Sumerian depiction, this female being has wings, just like the angels of biblical or gospel tradition. Next, let's look at another angel, in this case, a winged male figure, the god Haldi or Kaldi, a male winged Chaldean deity. Moving forward, we come to the Egyptians, the goddess Mat, again a winged goddess. She's a female winged deity from Egypt. Let's go now to ancient Greece. This is the winged goddess Ananke, who belongs to Greek culture. But there's an interesting point to make here, because these examples all come from the region where the civilizations closest to us developed. That is, the Middle East, the Chaldeans, the Sumerians, or closer still, the Egyptians, and the Greeks. But if we move, for example, to a civilization that we never actually encountered, the great Mayans, those who built those magnificent cities, they're not the same Mayans we know today, but those who founded that vast kingdom, we're all familiar with, because even today there are wonderful ruins. I've visited several myself. The great Mayans, astronomers, mathematicians, experts in the cosmos and so on, never actually met Western people because they mysteriously disappeared about 8 centuries before the arrival of the Spaniards. Now, these two statues are found in the Mayan city of Ekbalam in Mexico, and they represent 2 male winged Mayan deities. Now, funnily enough, the Mayans, without having consulted anyone from, let's say, our known culture, also depicted their winged deities with wings. And this is a very interesting topic to analyze. Evidently, Daniela, by instinct, when human beings came into contact with these entities, they instinctively added wings to them because, being completely human-like, there had to be a way to tell them apart. And the way to distinguish them was to give them wings. And we'll get to understanding why angels were given wings. Let's now take a look.
And whether they really are wings, actually.
And whether they really are wings, right? Absolutely. But first, I'd like to do a brief overview, so let's go and look at a few passages from the Bible where angels are mentioned. Let's go to Genesis. Genesis 18. And I'll quote the verses. Abraham lifted his eyes and saw 3 men standing nearby. Abraham hurried to the tent to Sarah and said, "Quick, take 3 measures of fine flour, knead it, and make some flatbreads." Then Abraham ran to the herd, selected a tender and choice calf, and gave it to a servant, who quickly prepared it. He took butter, milk, and the calf that had been prepared, and set them before them, and they ate. In the pictorial representations, we see these 3 angels with wings, talking with Abraham. Then those men, so these angels were initially referred to as men, then those men rose up and looked towards Sodom. The 2 angels arrived in Sodom in the evening, so, interestingly, here we have the Bible describing angels as men. In the painting, we see the angels with wings. Abraham doesn't have wings, but in fact, these angels, in their, let's say, purely material expression, eat and drink. Abraham offers them meat, butter, and milk. And then, the Bible also says that Abraham calls his wife Sarah and says, "Prepare some bread." So, these men, or rather, these angels, have very human traits, but still,
They like
they're
to
angels.
eat. So we've learned they enjoy eating.
They've got a refined palate. Let's say they've got a divine appetite.
They were probably looking for Michelin stars, let's put it that way.
So, since, in reality, not many people, Daniela, actually read the scriptures, I want to point out these 2 aspects, that not only are these angels called men in the very same Bible, but they're not ethereal beings, as people often imagine, but real, tangible entities who sit down, eat and drink, just like any other human being. And let's turn to St. Paul. St. Paul, in his letter to the Hebrews, basically says, "Do not forget hospitality, for by doing so, some have entertained angels without knowing it." So, what does this tell us? St. Paul was certainly someone who knew angels well. They helped him, and there are several things about that described, especially in the Acts of the Apostles. And basically, St. Paul is telling me that I could mistake an ordinary human being for an angel. And so, if I can mistake an angel for an ordinary human, it means the angel doesn't have wings. And so I deduce from these few verses, and there are many more in the scriptures, that wings are symbolic. And it's no coincidence. If we look at symbols, it's no coincidence that angels who come from the sky, whether luminous or not, don't have wings. So this whole idea of wings is an iconography that symbolizes flight. And we use it too. In our own air squadrons, helicopters, and so on, we have insignias, emblems, flight groups and squadrons that either feature birds or depict wings. Here, I've picked out 3 at random. So, the wing, for us modern humans who have aviation, is the symbol of flight. But isn't it the same thing in ancient times? So the angel isn't just a person or a being who performs, let's say, a spiritual flight, but maybe also someone who literally flies. I mean, that in ancient times there were people who could fly, and therefore people who were not of this world, not from earth, because angels, as we know, are not earthly beings, if anything. Humans are more like demons than angels, if we really look at what we get up to every single day. So, the angel is an entity that performs flight, both physical and dimensional. But since they flew and came from the sky, which is a mystical sky, but also a material one, meaning an astronomical sky, let's say, then let's see whether this idea I'm putting forward might have a trace of truth, still within Scripture. Let's look, for example, actually no, rather than Scripture, let's look at sacred iconography, to see if these angels might be using some kind of craft, let's say, that left evidence in the pictorial depictions, meaning vehicles that are described in Scripture as clouds, or pillars of fire, or other kinds of things within which sometimes there's the Lord, the so-called Lord, and which could therefore be craft that these angels in ancient times used to come and visit human beings. Here's this painting from the 1500s by Carlo Braccesco, the Triptych of the Annunciation. And we see a Madonna who looks almost frightened, or rather clearly frightened, because the Archangel Gabriel, the announcing Archangel Gabriel, we're talking about the central panel of the altarpiece, and we can see that the announcing angel isn't flying with his wings, he's flying on a disc. He's standing on a disc that carries him toward the Madonna, and she almost steps back because she sees this object approaching. Just a couple of examples, Daniela. There are many more. Let's move on to another painting. This one is from around the 1500s, Madonna with Child Jesus, and Saint John the Baptist. The attribution is uncertain, either Sebastiano Mainardi or Jacopo del Celaio, and we see a beautiful scene, pictorially speaking, with the Holy Mother. And then we have Saint John the Baptist. We recognize him because, besides the halo, he has the cross, the typical one carried by Saint John the Baptist, over his shoulder, and there's a child Jesus pointing toward the Madonna. But if we look to the right, at the details of this panel, this circular panel, and we enlarge the scene, we're looking at the upper right part of the altarpiece. We can see an object flying, a classic flying disc. We see a man shading his eyes with his hand, trying to protect himself from the brightness, and we see a dog. This is a typical scene of a sighting. So, how is it possible that these elements, by the way, the disc, you can see it shines. It emits rays of light. It's glowing. How could it be that this...
golden, at least from what you can see on the screen. Yes, when it was made by all the...
This is a painting from the 1500s, I think it's, if I'm not mistaken, displayed in Florence. So it's a real painting, but as I said, Daniela, I just picked 2 of them, just to give us a sense of what we're talking about. But now, let's read some passages from the Bible, this time using modern photographs. So from paintings, we move to photos.
Right.
So here we have 2 photos taken by the contactee George Adamski, and we'll compare them with Isaiah. First, in the photos, we see this cylindrical object, rounded at both ends, from which luminous objects emerge. And this is a scene that Adamski, back in the 1950s, photographed using a telescope to which he had attached a camera. And in the second photo, we can see that from this large cigar-shaped object, as we might call it, several others have come out. So in the first photo on my left, we can see two luminous objects emerging from this large cylinder or cigar-shaped craft. In the other photo, there are 6 of them. And could it be that Isaiah, in ancient times, witnessed this same scene or something similar? Who are these that fly along like a cloud and like doves to their windows? The scene is perfectly represented by this photo here. So, in ancient times, long before the airplane was invented, which, as we know, the Wright brothers developed around the 1800s or so, there were already those who could fly. But it wasn't only a spiritual kind of flight, it was a physical one, and it speaks of those, meaning other beings, angelic as we'd call them, who come from the sky but go out and return to their dove houses. In other words, they act like doves. Obviously, the prophet Isaiah in that era couldn't understand technology, and so his comparison, the way he describes this scene, is purely framed by his own reality. He couldn't talk about spaceships, airplanes, or helicopters. He spoke of doves because in ancient times, the only things that flew were birds, certainly not objects. Exactly, not.
I was just thinking that if we were to bring, say, a man from the Amazon today and showed him a hydrojet, someone flying over the water, he'd mistake him
In this
for
regard,
a deity.
I have something very interesting to tell you. If I may,
Sure.
I'll tell you a story. That's quite curious and might interest our viewers as well. Basically, after the Second World War, when Japan was defeated, the Americans abandoned several small support bases that were located on tiny islands along the route toward Japan. And on these islands they would stop to refuel, to resupply, to pick up various things and so on. They had these bases, let's say, not large ones, but still places where American planes would land and take off again, like a relay toward Japan. When the war ended, and of course on these islands there were indigenous people who had never seen a white man, let alone had any knowledge of aircraft technology or anything like that. After the war ended, a few years later, anthropologists began wondering what had happened to these tribes, who, for the first time in their history, had come into contact with Western technological man. They had seen airplanes, so the researchers went to these islands and discovered something incredible. A religion had actually formed, called the cargo cult. The cargo cult, I invite people to look it up, because you'll find it easily enough. And what did they find? They found that the islanders had built straw airplanes with woven sticks and straw, and had established a priestly caste that kept a sacred fire burning constantly, waiting for the gods who came from the sky to return to them. And why was that? What was the curious part? That when these Americans landed on the islands, they came into contact with the natives, sometimes giving them chocolate or Coca-Cola. For them, those were divine foods because they came from the sky. And so, a religion was established, which was called the cargo cult. So if this happened in modern times, why couldn't it have happened in ancient times when human beings, let's say, ancient ones, not technological, not scientific, not rational, came into contact with a reality that was scientifically and technologically more advanced? Let's look at another passage from the Bible. Here we are, let's go to Exodus. Exodus 13, verses 21 and 22. The Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud. So this pillar of cloud was presumably gray, dark in color, to guide them along the way. So we're in the historical moment when the Hebrews were freed by Moses from the slavery of the Egyptian Pharaoh and were led into the desert to begin their journey to the Promised Land. By night, the pillar of cloud became a pillar of fire to give them light, so they could travel by day and by night. The pillar of cloud by day never left the sight of the people, nor the pillar of fire by night. If the cloud remained over the dwelling for 2 days, a month, or a year, the Israelites stayed in camp and did not move. Now, Daniela, I don't know of any meteorological cloud that stays fixed for 2 days, a month, or a year, so the ancients, just like
Only that of smog. Only that of smog.
it wasn't
In the
there at the
Padana
time,
Valley, only smog.
but back then everything was organic.
Exactly.
So the ancients, like Isaiah did, used comparisons drawn from their natural world to describe something that, for them, was incomprehensible. And here, again, in George Adamski's photos, we see a dark column, so a dark cloud, because it's flying, it's in the sky, and we see a column of light that shines through these kinds of portholes. But then this light can increase in intensity. This is something that has been reported by many contactees and witnesses. It can grow brighter. And just like the previous flying discs we've seen made of energy, these cigar-shaped crafts can also turn into pure energy. So if we make the comparison, in ancient times, something very similar was likely happening. And look here, this is another photo by George Adamski showing a beautiful pillar of fire, a cigar-shaped object that Adamski photographed in the 1950s. We can see it on the left in the slide, photographed in the 1950s. So this reality, which in ancient times was described by the prophets or by the men of that era who witnessed these events, can now be seen depicted in the photos taken by those we call contactees. Let's look at another one. Let's take a passage from Ezekiel. At the center appeared the figure of 4 living beings. This was their appearance, they had human likeness. So once again, we find ourselves with angelic figures in this case, cherubim who still have a human form, meaning they are human-like beings. And Ezekiel says, "As I looked at those beings, I saw a wheel on the ground beside each of them, all 4 of them, because there were 4 figures. The appearance of the wheels and their structure was like a wheel within a wheel. Their rims were tall and awesome, and all 4 rims were full of eyes all around." In this flying disc photographed by George Adamski, also in the 1950s, we see circles that are not positioned vertically like bicycle wheels, but horizontally circles, stacked one on top of another in different sizes, and we can also see that they have eyes all around, which are actually the portholes of the so-called flying saucer. So, if we bridge the cultural gap between that ancient context and today's, we find that the prophet's descriptions perfectly match those found in contactees' reports. Now, let's look beyond our own religious tradition. This here is a painting, a wheel of fire, sighted in Japan around 900 AD, showing that this kind of manifestation was global in nature. You can see a disc surrounded by flames at the top center of the image. Let's go much further back in time, to an era that was completely pre-Christian and pre-Judaic. Here we are in the caves of Neo in France, and it's a rock engraving carved on the inner walls of these caves, where on the left we see one large figure, and on the right we see others found in the same cave system. Now, just like in comic books, we see a stationary disc-shaped object. Then next to it, another disc-shaped object with small dots above it. This represents a type of motion we call the falling leaf movement, the typical motion of flying saucers, since they travel using electromagnetic fields. And below, we again see a stationary disc-shaped object and another in motion, with its movement indicated by those dots. Now, could it really be a coincidence that, if we look at modern times, look at this photo? This is a photo taken in Mexico just a few days ago, on April 11th, by Juan Manuel Sanchez, a Mexican contactee whom I personally know. I was there in Valle Hermoso, in the state of Tamaulipas, and he sent me the originals of these 3 photos, in which we can see exactly the same type of object carved into the caves of Niue from 12,000 years ago. And from these 3 photos, it's clear because first it's here, then it's here, and then it moves again like this. In the first photo, it's to the upper left of the sun. In the second, almost directly above it. In the third photo, the object has descended and shifted again to the left. So this type of phenomenon manifests the same way now as it did back then. And let's move to a more modern era. The visions of Theresa Neumann, who was a stigmatized mystic, and who spoke of these beings, these angels. Earlier we saw the painting of the Annunciation, where Gabriel is resting on a flying disc, arriving, so to speak, on a flying saucer. And here we have instead the mystical vision of Theresa Neumann, the great stigmatized woman. Hitler had a kind of sacred fear of her. In fact, he ordered his troops to leave the small village where she lived alone. Theresa Neumann
Let's say out
saw...
of respect, certainly not out of fear.
Yes, Hitler was extremely superstitious. He was afraid of blood. And since Theresa Neumann bore the stigmata, he feared her, so he avoided persecuting her. In fact, Neumann also supported anti-Nazi groups, yet Hitler never harmed her. Let's turn to the description of her vision. Theresa Neumann sees a young woman, and here we return to the question of whether angels have wings. Theresa Neumann, I repeat, sees a young woman, almost a girl, in a small house, deeply immersed in prayer. Suddenly, before her stands a luminous man. He didn't enter, he's simply there. Johannes Steiner, who was both a witness and Neumann's biographer, that is, he transcribed the visions that Theresa later recounted to him, was present during this vision, and asked her, did he have great wings? Because, of course, in Christian iconography, angels are depicted with wings, and she replied, what are you thinking? Luminous men don't need wings. The luminous man lets return to the vision bows before the frightened young woman and speaks to her, saying, Shalom Lich, Miriam Gaceta, which means, peace to you, purest Mary. So these angels can be either material and they eat, as we saw in the passage from Genesis with Abraham, or they can be beings of energy, capable of mastering matter, able to raise the frequency of their material, even bodily form, and transform it into pure light. Now, funnily enough, this same feature is also found in the craft they use. These are 3 photos, taken by Antonio Giannuzzi in Lecce, following directions from the one who was my spiritual father, Eugenio Siragusa, back in 1975. So Giannuzzi actually shot them without seeing anything himself. It was Eugenio who indicated the spot where he had to shoot, where he had to aim the camera, and we see a classic UFO. That in the top photo is in a material state, then shifts to an energetic state. So, these beings have abilities not only of transmutation between matter and energy, which Einstein, with his famous formula, E equals mc squared, showed us, but they can do it with biological matter as well. And here we have a video filmed in September 1958 in Pennsylvania, in the Blue Mountains, where we can actually see these objects in both material and energetic phases. You can see the falling leaf motion, that swaying movement we saw engraved in the caves of Niue, in those Niue cave engravings. Here we see a disc-shaped object, half material and half energetic, and here we have exactly the same representation. Sorry, the very same scene shown in the caves of Neo. The same disc-shaped object filmed thousands of years later, performing that falling leaf motion I mentioned earlier. Here we have a sphere moving behind a branch. You can see it's metallic, and at a certain point, in a flash, it becomes energy. So we're dealing with beings who have technical capabilities that, for us, are absolutely unimaginable. Another object, also filmed by Howard Menger, in the United States, in Pennsylvania, in the 1950s. In 58 exactly shows again this reality that existed thousands of years ago and was reported in the scriptures. And today we can also, in this case too, you can see the flying disc filmed from below. We see the underside of the object, and it is semi-material or semi-energetic, if you will, where the dark central area is certainly cooler than the large circular wing that forms the flying disc. So, this reality, these records, put us, if you will, squarely before the fact that we need to re-examine, in some way, and understand with a more critical and modern eye, a reality that manifested in ancient times and still manifests today. Because clearly, as we said, angel means messenger, that message, that information these beings gave us, including through what they did and said, continues even today. And from this we can move on to what I consider today to be modern prophecy. That would be Contactism. But before moving on, Daniela, I don't know if you have any questions.
I wanted to... No, it's clear that these are all images that tell us about a journey through history. What's missing are the cave paintings of primitive people, which I vaguely recall maybe some are shown, but still.
I showed those from Neo, but in fact,
Exactly.
the scene there is more complex. That's a detail, because in the engraved scene, there are also human figures who watch and see.
They're found all over the world. They cut across all cultures. They're present, as we said, in all the sacred scriptures, and they match perfectly with the biblical passages. What are we still missing?
We're missing one thing: to understand who they really are, why they come, and what they want. But I want to give that answer after reading a few passages.
That's for sure. That's definitely because we're curious to know.
After reading a few passages which, this time, aren't biblical, but are written by the contactees, who are the authors of those images Menger, Siragusa, and so on, but are the descriptions they themselves give in their books. So let's look at the first one, since we've seen quite a few photos of George Adamski. Here it is. This is the third book Adamski wrote, and on page 117 we read, "I have conducted research on this subject also, because the extraterrestrials I met often spoke to me about their visits to Earth in biblical times." And then on page 118 we read again, "Being this my conviction," says Adamski, "I repeat, I will now try to demonstrate how the space visitors are widely mentioned in the Bible, and how it was their common practice to offer guidance and help to the peoples of the world in ancient times, a mission they are once again pursuing today," writes George Adamski. Let's move on to Howard Menger, whose film we saw earlier, shot in Pennsylvania in the Blue Mountains. This is a book that was never published in Italy, his autobiography where he talks about the experiences he had with extraterrestrials, From Outer Space to You, by Howard Menger, published in 1959. And on pages 126 and 129, we read, "In late August 1956, I had what was perhaps the most memorable encounter of all, when I had the privilege of meeting one of the most evolved beings from another planet. And this being he met this master said, "In the year of your time, 1945, which was the year of the first atomic experiment on Earth, the Trinity test recently portrayed in a film about Oppenheimer, the man who created the atomic bomb, together with Fermi, based of course on Einstein's studies and so on. So, in the year 1945, we gathered a great group of servants of our infinite Father, that is, God whom you have called angels in your scriptures, to help you. So these angels bring us a message and help exactly. In modern times, just as in biblical times, that is, it is a mission that continues over a span of time unimaginable for us, namely across thousands and thousands of years. If we start with Moses, when there was the pillar of fire, the pillar of cloud that guided the Israelites, the Hebrews, then imagine arriving at today, there have passed truly thousands and thousands of years. Let's read another passage that also comes from a contact group in this case, a booklet written by the so-called the Berlin Circle of Peaceful Mediums of Berlin. From the 1950s to the 1960s, where one of these beings speaks, one of these angels, one of these extraterrestrials, and says, "Our existence and presence are eternally bound to the law given on Sinai. Since you were not technically advanced enough, in past years we could not explain all of this to you, because you would not have understood us any more than Moses and the other Israelites did. But today, you too, with your technology and your science, are on the threshold of the universe. And you can firmly believe in the possibility of a power that comes from the universe." So then, in this text we find let's say, an echo of what Jesus says in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he says to Peter, who had just cut off Malchus's ear, "Not only, Peter, put your sword back into its sheath, but also, do you not know that if I wanted, I could ask my Father for more than 12 legions of angels? Who would then set him free?" Now, why does Jesus, a man who belonged to Palestine, to Judea, and thus to a people oppressed under the iron heel of Rome, use a Roman term, legion? Because he means to indicate that he could be the leader, able to ask for the help of, in quotation marks, soldiers, not of this world, and that, if he wished, they could free him from that situation. And thus, in this case, this being called Astar Sharon, which, in reality, is not a name but a title, meaning Holy Commander. He says, why can you not believe in the possibility of a power that comes from the universe? So, we read, in a different and more modern form, those very words that Christ said to Peter. I'll end these quotations with the one who was my spiritual father, Eugenio Siragusa, one of the most important contactees of modern history, undoubtedly the most important from the point of cultural and scientific understanding, through whom these beings described, at the highest level, far more than any other contactee in modern history, the true nature of these beings. And so we have the synonym, the comparison, where the angels of yesterday are today those we call extraterrestrials, that is, they come and bring the same message. This writing that Eugenio penned on September 4th, 1990, is a record of what these extraterrestrial beings told him. I'll read it. Know that it is we who are the makers of all the wonders that you earthlings have placed on the religious plane. We are the angels of yesterday, the messengers who traveled on chariots of fire or burning shields. We are the extraterrestrials of today, who are striving to save what can still be saved on your planet in serious crisis because of your reckless and destructive activity. It is still only the beginning. Here the being speaks in relation to what is happening in the world, that is, the things taking place around the world. We are in 1990. So, the great wars of the United States and the Middle East are just beginning. It is still only the beginning of an unthinkable, unimaginable drama, laden with irreversible troubles, sours of death and destruction. Now, with the military confrontation between Russia and Ukraine exactly, with the risk that this clash, which in reality is being fought on Ukrainian soil, but behind which stand the NATO forces, Italy included, and primarily the United States, there is a risk that this conflictual situation that NATO is losing in an astonishing way could escalate into a clash even through the use of atomic weapons. There are Ukrainians who, in a truly irresponsible and criminal manner, are bombing the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. So, there is a dramatic situation. The other day, Iran responded by launching drones and missiles against Israel, which had bombed the Iranian embassy in Syria. So, yes, in Syria, that's right. So we have a situation today that is truly catastrophic. Therefore, these words dictated 23 years ago, 24 years ago now, are absolutely prophetic. And these things tell us, these events tell us, that this presence protects, watches, and will probably intervene in the case that humanity makes the irreparable mistake, that is, presses the button for a nuclear launch. So their presence, which has been explained precisely in these terms by themselves, that is, they are here because they fear that a nuclear conflict might occur, given the fact that there are thousands upon thousands of extremely powerful nuclear warheads today, compared to which those of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were practically like the fireworks of a patron saint's festival. Today the situation is truly serious, and they are here. Look, by the way, there's Daniela. I didn't include her in this.
But the question, I was listening to all of this because it's always very interesting. I mean, are they protecting the planet or humanity? Because if they're protecting the planet, as if planet Earth were a cell of a single living body, then that's my question. Who are they protecting? The universal body itself.
Yes.
And so they want to preserve planet Earth, but couldn't care less about humanity. That's the direction of my question.
No, if they didn't care about humanity, surely they wouldn't. No, I'm answering. I'm saying that if they didn't care about humanity, I say this also because there are some so-called researchers who claim that we are cows, to be milked and slaughtered for.
A professor from Tuscany, no, actually I shouldn't even say Tuscan, right?
A character.
CM.
One of those who says we're being drained of our souls. But the real ones, the real culprits, are those sitting on the high thrones of world powers, on all the seats of global authority. So,
It's
obviously,
connected, because I always hear talk, about the protection of the planet, of humanity, the planet, because maybe the planet is part of something that we can't really comprehend, something so vast.
of course, I can say that there are various aspects to this, and if you want, I can explain them one by one. So, a first aspect is undoubtedly one that concerns them personally. That is, Earth is in the solar system is in the galaxy. So, if we, in a foolish, irresponsible, and utterly criminal way, wage a nuclear war, given the fact that we have thousands of nuclear warheads capable of destroying, literally pulverizing planet Earth several times over, it's obvious that this would be a massive problem beyond Earth itself, because it would mean that the planets of the solar system would go haywire and drift from their orbits. The solar system, this whole region of the galaxy, would be contaminated by horrific levels of radioactivity, and that becomes a problem even for them, since they are space travelers. So first, that. Second, planet Earth is a living cell of a greater body. So, along with that first concept, this one also applies. It must be safeguarded and protected. Third, since they are beings of great evolution, not only scientific but also ethical and moral, they therefore feel love for the good people who do not wish for all this. They are here to help that part of humanity, unfortunately a small minority, that resists and opposes this terrible course of events. that we are living through. Not only wars, but also pollution, social injustice, world hunger, extreme wealth on one side, and extreme poverty on the other. So they oppose this condition of the world. They are against it. So theirs is not only a scientific or technical watch to prevent the planet from exploding, but also an ethical aid. And even through these writings, they wish to bring about a cultural reform of the human being. You see, Daniela and I say this also to you, my friends who are listening. Every revolution arises from a new vision of life. So, from the Ptolemaic system, where the Earth was the center of the universe, we arrive at Galileo Galilei, who demonstrated with his telescope that in reality it was the Earth that revolved around the Sun. And from that scientific revolution, in fact, the modern era began, and, of course, many other things as well. So, if revolutions, that is, transformations arise from a new vision of life, whether it be philosophical, political, social, economic, or scientific, then today, when we find ourselves in such a devastating situation, we need a new revolution to improve the state of things. But there is a problem. The culture of the people is the same as the culture of the ruling class, that is, the values are identical. Therefore, these beings bring us a new vision of life, new scientific knowledge, new spiritual knowledge whereby they end the religion of religious beliefs and introduce to us the science of the spirit, a tangible, rational science, just as our material science is, but one that they bring into the field that for us has always been religion, that is, the spirit and the soul. These beings possess scientific and instrumental knowledge of what the soul is and of what the spirit is, in the hope that this kind of inoculation of knowledge, so to speak, may produce in the lives of human beings, whether individually or in groups, positive changes that may help them to help us. Because if there is not that grain, so to speak, to cultivate, then all that remains is weeds, and the weeds, as Scripture says, are burned in the fire. So the angels of yesterday, the extraterrestrials of today, are simply continuing the same program of salvation, of which Christ, through his magnificent and terrible sacrifice, was the supreme expression. Thus the angels, Christ, the salvation of the planet, ethics, and the evolution of humanity, not only from a technological but also from a spiritual standpoint, are all part of, let's say, the plans of these beings who are here to help us. That is, in short, the essence of the message.
So the soul becomes the union of everything, because there is, after all, an evolution of the human being, despite what we see and hear. Many people are becoming more sensitive and opening themselves to projects, or in any case, to research on the soul. It came to mind while you were speaking Faggin, the inventor of the microchip.
Federico Faggin, yes, exactly.
Who spent an entire life, right? Being, square as the English would say, very rational, and now he runs a foundation that studies the soul, research on the soul, right?
And on consciousness, yes, yes.
And on
Federico,
consciousness, it's very interesting.
yes, I've listened to several of his talks. I haven't yet had the pleasure and the honor of meeting him. If he ever sees this program, I'll say it here. Federico, if you're listening, it would be a pleasure to meet you.
He shows up every now and then. Not here with us, though. Not in Veneto, because he's Padua adopted, but originally from Vicenza.
Yes, he's the father of the microchip, and therefore
Silicon
absolutely
Valley.
qualified to speak about artificial intelligence. He said, "My dear friends,
Goodbye.
you are mistaken. Artificial intelligence is not consciousness. So, no matter how much you try to create or reproduce, intelligence without consciousness is not true intelligence. Therefore, consciousness is the highest expression that defines us as human beings. It is the I am, the self-awareness, the I am. We can say, I am. Artificial intelligence may imitate it, but it is not aware of itself." Faggin said, he gave an example that I really liked. He said, we could build a
The one
beautiful...
about the drone in the desert? No?
No. I'll use another one that's more poetic. He said, we could build an automaton equipped with extraordinary sensors, so that if I let it smell a rose, it recognizes it and says, "The flower you're showing me is a rose." But in that kind of artificial entity, no feelings or memories would arise, the kind that awaken in us humans when we smell the fragrance of a rose. So this is something that is absolutely inimitable in human nature. After all, we are the expression of a higher intelligence, so much so that we still don't fully understand how this body works, which ages and decays, much to our dismay. Thus we are the expression, the realization, if we may use the term, of an intelligence immeasurably greater and more advanced than ourselves. Of course, Daniela, all these reflections are just a small glimpse of something much broader and more extensive, but it was right to touch on them in the short time we had,
Of course.
to understand what we're really talking about.
But I liked it because this reflection on the soul is spreading more and more. I see that we're also following Faggin and what he's doing because it's truly fascinating.
Careful, Daniela. The soul is not the same as consciousness.
No, it's something else.
It's something different. The soul is a highly complex energetic structure that today can even be, at least in some aspects, filmed or photographed, because technology has advanced greatly. Starting from the old Kirlian camera, today we have far more advanced tools. I know a researcher named Daniele Gula. He's a scientist, and he actually develops technical instruments, and with his cameras he can record the pulsing luminous emission that radiates from our bodies. So we possess an immaterial part, an energetic part. We can also mention the studies of Professor Albert Fritz Popp, who, back in the 60s and 70s, spoke of biophotons, that is, the emission of photons, of light, from living beings. So, let's say, the problem is that certain discoveries don't serve the interests of large multinational corporations, whether pharmaceutical companies or the great lords of academic science. And so they are concealed, and people are told nothing. But in truth, we have already made great progress on this topic. The Soviets themselves, who were atheists, and thus cared nothing for religious matters, studied the soul and called it the form-structuring field. That is, the field that brings order and specialization to the body's cells. It is what gives, so to speak, coherence and harmony, by which the human body is based on fractal geometry. And on the golden ratio, every proportion in the human body follows that divine harmony. Thus, if chaos is disorder and intelligence is order, the human body is so perfectly ordered that it gives rise to something we are still trying to understand, and that something is life.
That something is life.
Indeed, conscious life, so we are the expression of something much higher. People often say, Daniela, but where is God? We have no proof. And I say, look in the mirror. You have the proof right in front of you that God exists.
After all, he
The
made
problem
us in
is,
his image and likeness, though. Well,
we are in his image and
some of
likeness.
us turned out a bit less perfect than others.
No, he gave us freedom, Daniela, free will.
Sure.
Then he set down the laws and told us that free will is governed by the law of cause and effect. He who lives by the sword shall die by the sword, what the Orientals call karma. So we are subject to natural laws even on the spiritual plane, which means, you see, if we take a bird's-eye view of humanity, how is it possible that, despite the vast differences in religious beliefs among human beings, and even among atheists for me, atheism is just another religion still, regardless of the religious condition or faith of human beings. All of us are born, grow old, and die. Therefore, nature cares nothing for our religious beliefs. It rules us completely, according to its own laws. Because I challenge anyone to say they wish to grow old and die, yet nature imposes this upon us. So we are subject to laws, even on the spiritual level. And thus, these beings fill us through their messages and their teachings. They fill a terrible void which, in my view, is the deep ignorance that humanity has about itself and about creation. And that ignorance is the root of all the troubles we are experiencing, both on the individual level and up to geopolitics with these terrible wars that bathe planet Earth in blood, as they always have throughout known history.
That's the way it is. As the film 2001, A Space Odyssey teaches us, remember, humanity discovered the bone as its first weapon, and things aren't so different today. We're still wielding that same club.
2001, A Space Odyssey is a
Kubrick.
magnificent film by Kubrick, a masterful synthesis of symbolism, in which he explains, though it wasn't much understood, that the origin of humanity comes from beyond, from space itself. The monolith is the symbol, and it ends with the final scene, where from space appears a child with those great, wide-open eyes, the announcement of a new era.
Let's hope that new era arrives. We'd just like to enjoy a peaceful weekend. So if anyone happens to have bad intentions, let's hope that those who are meant to watch over us are indeed watching, because we surely
They
need
are
it.
watching, Daniela,
That's for
24
sure,
hours
and
a day.
it's beautiful. Then I truly want to thank Pier Giorgio Caria for being with us today, for the precious time he's given us, and for what he'll share with us in the future, because it's impossible not to wish to listen to all this. Wisdom, research, and truth. We'll see each other on Monday with someone else. I can't quite remember who you see. One must be
Some
honest. Someone will be here with us, and I wish you all a good weekend. Thank you again, Pier Giorgio Caria.
Thank you, Daniela. My greetings to you all.
Thank you.
Listeners, see you soon. Goodbye.
See you soon.